Hi there and welcome to our first gaming memories video dedicated entirely to the Sega Megadrive. Now the Megadrive I would say is definitely my favourite of all retro consoles, and I had lots of great memories playing it over the years. I didn't actually have one when I was a kid, but I did look at them enviously in the computer shops at the time and also in the magazines. And eventually I got to play one in about 1993 when one of my friends got hold of one. I distinctly remember going round to his house and spending evenings playing Sonic the Hedgehog and Ghostbusters amongst others. In the mid-90s while I was at university I finally bought my own Megadrive. By then the PlayStation and Saturn had been released, so the Megadrive was looking a little bit old hat, but that meant games could be picked up pretty cheaply on the second-hand market, and I certainly took advantage of that. Eventually I did sell that console on, but when I got interested in retro gaming in the mid-2000s, the Megadrive was one of the first consoles I bought. In 2007 I won a competition at a retro gaming event, and the prize was a Sega Megadrive 2 modded to play games from all regions, and that's the system I use to this day. Now of course there's loads of great games for the Megadrive, but one thing it's particularly well known for is its range of shoot-'em-ups, with over 50 shooters available on the system ranging from arcade conversions to original games. One problem now though is if you want to collect these games they're really quite prohibitively expensive. At the top end of the scale you've got Japanese exclusives like Glaylancer and Eliminate Down, which will cost you hundreds of pounds to get hold of, but even common PAL games such as the cult shooters Zero Wing and Truxton can cost you well over £50. You'll even find yourself paying £30 plus for bang average shooters like Arrow Flash and Twin Hawk. So is it still possible to pick up a Megadrive shooter for a low price? Well, unsurprisingly, that's what this video is about. I've picked out 10 games that you should be able to pick up if you're patient from eBay for under £20 each for a box copy, though it may not include the instructions. And I've ranked this list rather than by personal preference by the value of the game, the price you'd expect to pay from low to high, although obviously the higher priced games are generally the better ones. So without further ado, let's take a look at 10 shmups that might give you the best bang for your buck.
First up we have Super Thunderblade, published in Europe by Sega in 1990. This is a follow-up to the 1987 arcade game Thunderblade and was a launch title for both the Mega Drive in Japan and the Genesis in the States. As with its predecessor, the player takes control of a helicopter to blast away at numerous enemies with its cannon and missiles. A distinctive feature of the game is the use of different viewpoints. During normal gameplay and when fighting mid-level bosses, the game utilises a third-person perspective from behind the helicopter, but the camera changes to a top-down view when fighting end-of-level bosses. In addition to hostile enemies, each of the game's 4 stages feature environmental hazards that you must avoid crashing into. The game is for the most part a very simplistic sprite scaling 3D shooter, with no power-ups and just one button used to fire both machine guns and rockets. The graphics are big and well drawn, but movement is quite slow and the soundtrack is quite generic as befits an early release for the system. Initially it seems quite tricky, as it can be quite difficult to judge if enemy bullets or landscape elements are going to hit you. However, on the first level it soon becomes easy when you realise you can just move in small circles in the middle of the screen and wipe out most adversaries. Most of the enemies are very similar, but the mid-level tank boss on the first stage is impressive. When you reach the end of the stage, the action switches to the overhead view as you go on a bombing run on the main boss. This more closely resembles a 2D vertical scroller, but you can't move up or down, only side to side, so it is quite limited. Later levels introduce more dangerous enemies and challenging environmental hazards to avoid, but otherwise it's very samey. Overall, this is a pretty poor early Mega Drive game, which tries to recreate Sega's legendary 3D style arcade games, but fails due to being too slow as the hardware isn't really up to it. It's not really comparable to the proper 2D shooters that are going to appear in this list, but if you're looking for a really cheap shoot-'em-up for the system, then this is the one to go for. If you do want to give it a try, my recommendation would be to pick up the Mega Games 3 compilation for roughly the same price, which also includes Alien Storm and Super Monaco GP. Next on the list is Wonder Boy 3 Monster Lair. This was published by Sega in 1991, a conversion of their 1988 arcade game. This is another game that isn't quite a full-on 2D shooter, but it certainly has elements of one. The game supports 2 simultaneous players who control either a green-haired boy named Leo or a pink-haired girl called Princess Priscilla. They must make their way through a number of stages, dispatching the invaders that are attempting to destroy their land. Unlike other games in the series, the gameplay consists of action and shooter scenes. Each level begins as a permanently scrolling platform run and gun, with the player able to jump and shoot projectiles from a sword. The second half of each stage sees you ride a flying dragon in a horizontal shoot-'em-up with a boss battle at the end. As with the original Wonder Boy game, the player's life bar steadily diminishes as time passes in the platform stages. Health is gained through collection of fruit and weapons upgrades. In the shooter scenes, vitality remains static unless hit by an enemy. This was the final Wonder Boy game to be released in the arcades, as the series moved to be more of an RPG-like platformer in later sequels, and this is certainly the most different game in the series. The platform sections do bear some resemblance to the original game, but are shorter and much faster paced. They can be challenging due to the permanent scrolling, as badly timed jumps can lead to quick deaths, and there are a few near leaps of faith to negotiate too. These sections do honour the graphical style of the first game, with familiar environments such as islands and caves, enemies like snails, bats and rolling boulders, and plenty of fruit to collect. The fairies from the original game feature too, offering food enhancements or invulnerability. When you get to the horizontal shooter sections that qualify the game for this video, they are again quite short, with repetitive formations of enemies to eliminate or avoid before you face the boss at the end. The bosses are well designed, with different attack patterns that require you to move quickly around the screen to survive, so your reactions are well tested. The game's very generous with power-ups, as you get them for destroying a small group of the same type of enemy, and there's a good variety of weapons with different strengths and weaknesses. Each only lasts a short time, but a new one is never far away, and sometimes you find yourself accidentally picking up a less effective one simply because there are so many on offer. The graphics are colourful and cute, and there are nice in-game tunes and good sound effects, and the standout level for me is the snow and ice one, which is really nicely done with great enemies such as snowmen, penguins and walruses. There's not a lot of variety from level to level, and it doesn't really get hard until stage 3 onwards, when the enemies get tougher and platforming elements become more challenging, but you get plenty of lives and continues, so it's quite accessible for the casual player. For me it is the worst of the 3 Wonder Boy arcade games, but it's still reasonably good fun with loads of stages and a fair difficulty curve, while the 2-player mode makes it a good one to play with a friend. From this point on, it's all legit 2D shooters, and next up is Thunder Force 2, developed by Technosoft and published in Europe by Sega in 1990. Thunder Force 2 was originally released in Japan for the Sharp X68000 computer in 1988. A year later it was ported to the Mega Drive and became one of 6 launch titles for the system's US release. Taking place soon after the original game, the Orn Empire creates a powerful new battleship and once again attacks the Galaxy Federation. The Federation learns that the battleship is housed deep below the surface of planet Nebula and takes the opportunity to plan an operation to take it down. The player controls the fighter-craft Exalizer and travels through a variety of stages to destroy Orn bases on Nebula and eventually find and destroy the enemy's battleship. Stages in the game are split into 2 formats. Each level begins with an overhead view perspective where the player has to locate and destroy the cores of a number of major enemy bases. After this is accomplished, the stage continues from a side view perspective which plays like a traditional horizontal scrolling shooter. After the boss of the side view section is defeated, the player moves on to the next level. Future installments of the series would abandon the top view stages and become purely horizontal shooters. The game introduced a weapons system that would become the staple for the rest of the series. The player's ship has a default arsenal of weapons which include a twin forward firing shot, a single forward and backward firing shot and a bomb shot in the top view stages. By collecting certain items, the weapons can be upgraded to a more powerful level, and the player can also obtain new weapons with various unique abilities. Once obtained, the player can switch between weapons at will, but if the ship is destroyed, all weapons are lost except for the default. Also available are the Craw add-ons, small pods which revolve around the ship. These block weak incoming bullets and provide extra firepower. As an early Mega Drive release, this game is pretty bare bones with no options menu on the title screen. What it does have though is lots of continues, and you'll probably need them because this game is pretty tough. The graphics are fairly generic space shooter fare, but there are lots of different enemies and the scenery is varied and well drawn. The sound effects are also generic and a bit weedy, but the soundtrack is a great early example of Mega Drive chip tunes. As I mentioned, each level begins with the overhead view section, which is probably most reminiscent of an arcade game like Bosconian, as you fly around blasting enemies, collecting power-ups and destroying the bases. These stages are quite large and can take ages if you can't track down the bases you need to eliminate, but there is a generous time bonus if you can complete the mission quickly. The bomb weapon on those sections only fires a short distance in front of you, which can make it quite hard to hit targets without being shot. The first level has some strange borders that need to be deactivated, and on later stages there are elements of scenery that you can crash into that you won't know about until you do. Combine that with quite a small vertical screen area and the fast pace and you have quite a challenge on your hands. Once you get past those stages, you're faced with some quite long horizontal sections that culminate in a large boss battle. These will be much more familiar to shooter fans but offer another stiff challenge with loads of enemies, bullets and scenery that will blow you up. Thankfully when you lose a life you immediately carry on rather than respawning at a checkpoint, so it's not too frustrating. That said, the horizontal section of the second stage introduces some barriers that span the screen and are almost impossible to avoid, so it does get ridiculously difficult from that point on. Your ship has a pretty generous hitbox that means you can avoid some bullets that would kill you in other games, and the selection of weapons is varied and interesting. It's quite easy to progress when fully powered up on the early stages, but lose them all and it'll become much harder to continue. Many gamers tend to discount this game due to those unusual overhead view levels, but they do add some variety, and if you're looking for an inexpensive way to get into the series, then this is a decent precursor to the later purely horizontal Thunder Force games. Moving from horizontal to vertical shooters, next up we have Mega Swiv. This was published by Time Warner Interactive in 1994 and it's a European exclusive for the Mega Drive. A secret underground race on an island in the mid-Atlantic Ocean has stolen military vehicles and equipment from around the world and built powerful war machines from them. Military officials of major countries have detected them, but they are afraid that they'll be unable to prepare against an assault by this race. Their plan is to send you in to infiltrate the enemy base and destroy them before they have a chance to unleash war upon the rest of the world. In this vertically scrolling game you can choose to control either a helicopter or a jeep, which have different advantages. The helicopter is not obstructed by obstacles, but the jeep can fire in any direction. Your vehicle is equipped with a selection of weapons by default, including bullet, flame and plasma shots. These can be powered up by collecting more of the same type, while other power-ups can be collected to award you with additional shot types, shields and a variety of smart bombs. Some enemies will reveal stars when destroyed, which can be collected for a bonus at the end of the level. This is a port of the SNES game Super Swiv and adds a brand new level at the beginning of the game. That first level is really quite difficult and certainly a lot harder than the second one, which was the first stage of the SNES version. The first thing I'll say is the Jeep is stupid and near impossible to make any progress with, so play as the chopper if you actually want to enjoy the game at all. Levels are long and fairly slow paced with a variety of flying and ground based targets. There's very little vertical space to manoeuvre in, so it can be hard to avoid enemies coming on screen. You'll also find yourself avoiding lots of enemies rather than shooting, simply because of how hard it is to get around the play area. The selection of weapons is good and power-ups are fairly plentiful. You can level up the pulse shot for a fairly impressive spread of fire and that makes it the best weapon overall, but the fire shot is quite powerful at lower levels. Generally the game is quite generic, but the bosses are quite inventive, especially the first one where you have to activate 4 plungers with your shots to destroy it. With no continues and that difficult first stage, it is a tough game to make progress on, and the graphics and sound are fairly unremarkable, with the backgrounds being especially drab. This is very much a Western design shooter and compares unfavourably to similar Japanese ones, but if you're looking for a military based vertical shmup on the Mega Drive, then this is the best you're going to get for under £20. Up next is Empire of Steel, also known as Steel Empire in some regions. This was published by Flying Edge in 1992. This horizontally scrolling shooter is notable in the genre for its unusual visual style. Being set in the late 19th century of an alternate world, the game's vehicles, weaponry and environments are heavily steampunk influenced. Propeller-based aircraft, dirigibles and heavily armoured steam trains are prominent throughout the game, with a vintage look to match. The backstory for the game explains that power-hungry dictator and industrialist General Styron rules by brute force and military might. Although the General's forces, known as Motorhead, have conquered and enslaved most of the world, one small independent republic remains free and defiant, Silverhead. Although dwarfed in number by the legions of Motorhead, the Silverhead Air Force is renowned for both the advanced technology of their aircraft and the aerial skill of their pilots. They're the last hope for freedom and they alone have the will and the weapons to bring about Motorhead's downfall. The player takes on the role of a Silverhead pilot, launched from their Titanic-sized airborne aircraft carrier, and has a choice of 2 different class of aircraft for each mission. The first option is the Striker, a swift and manoeuvrable aircraft. As well as firing standard shots ahead and to the rear, the Striker will launch bombs diagonally down towards ground-based targets. This advantage is not shared with the other craft and makes the Striker ideal as a ground attack orientated craft. The other option is the Z-01, a form of airship. Compared to the Striker, the Z-01 is a bigger target and is slower, yet is significantly tougher and more durable. This craft's specialty is aerial mines launched upward, which makes it more suited to skyward assaults than the Striker. Unlike many scrolling shooters, Empire of Steel allows the player to fire backwards as well as ahead. Players have the ability to collect power-ups, although the best tend to be in dangerous or hard to reach places. These power-ups include weapon enhancements, heat-seeking energy, health and speed boosts, and drones that serve as wingmen. Every 3 weapon power-ups of the same type increase the player's firepower strength by 1 level, up to a maximum of 20. To complete your mission you must fight through 7 progressively harder levels, each containing 1 or more bosses that must be defeated in order to advance to the next stage. This game really stands out from the shooter crowd due to its steampunk graphical style, while it also has some great military influenced tunes that fit the game well and some distinctive sound effects too. There's fantastic variety in the level designs, featuring everything from cities and caves to water and outer space, with some lovely detail in the backgrounds and impressive parallax scrolling. The variety of enemy craft is just as wide, and there are loads of huge bosses including R-type influenced giant ships that you have to work your way around and methodically bring down. Presentation wise it's impressive too, with cutscenes and a range of options including different difficulty levels with the number of lives and continues adjusted to fit. In game you have an energy bar as well as lives, so the game's not too demanding and a half decent player should see most of it on the medium level. The choice of 2 ships adds some replayability to the game, but choosing the right one for each level also adds some strategy, as some levels are definitely harder with one craft compared to the other. Another distinctive aspect of the game is the ability to fire forwards and backwards, but this is far from just a gimmick, as the reverse fire is vital when facing many of the bosses. Speaking of weapons, you have access to some decent power-ups, including levelling up your basic firepower, drones and smart bombs. You're also equipped with a ground-focused attack, but those bombs seem quite weedy considering how much they're needed. For all the game's good points, there are a few issues. It does get a bit samey towards the latter stages with loads of giant motherships to grind away at, and when there's a lot of sprites on screen it can slow down horribly. Also, the escape from the cave in the second half of level 2 is crazy fast, needing lightning reactions, and is really hard to complete without losing a couple of lives. Nevertheless, this is one of the more unique shooters on the system due to the art style and gameplay innovations, and undoubtedly one of the better low-priced options. Moving into the second half of this list then, next up we have Hellfire. This was released by Sega in 1990, a conversion of the 1989 Toplan arcade game. The first horizontal shoot 'em up to be created by Toplan, Hellfire takes place in the year 2998, where a space matter known as Black Nebula spreads and threatens to engulf the galaxy. Players assume the role of Space Federation Captain Lancer, taking control of the CNCS-1 space fighter craft in a surprise attack to overthrow the enemy over 6 challenging levels. A unique gameplay feature is the weapon system. Players are equipped with 4 main weapons at the beginning and switch between them by pressing the change button, with each one shooting in a fixed direction. The main weapon can be upgraded by picking up P icons, and other items can also be picked up such as speed boosts and B icons that award bonus points, which are crucial for reaching high scores to obtain extra lives. Exclusive to the Mega Drive version is the Hellfire weapon, capable of obliterating any enemy craft caught within its blast radius, as well as shield and a satellite option similar to those found in Gradius. Upon losing a life, your ship will start off at the last checkpoint it managed to reach before dying, and your ship's firepower and speed will be restored to its original state. Enemies include airborne craft and ground-based emplacements, and each stage features mid and end of level bosses. This is another early Mega Drive game and one of only a couple of arcade conversions on this list. It has to be said that the graphics are pretty ugly compared to many later games released for the system, especially the main ship, which looks like something you could have knocked up in shoot 'em up construction kits on the Amiga. On the upside, there's some interesting variation in the look of the scenery and enemies on each level, all having their own distinct theme. The sound effects and music are excellent, with the first stage in particular having a catchy tune that may be stuck in your head long after you've finished playing. The weapon system seems fun to begin with and is certainly required for the bosses, where you need to switch between weapons whilst also avoiding their shots and movement. Ultimately though, it ends up being overcomplicated, and it's annoying that you can only cycle between the 4 options one way, as you frequently go past the option you want in the heat of battle. Compounding this frustration is the Hellfire shot, which I barely used. A screen clearing smart bomb would be way easier, but just having the third button on the pad cycle the primary weapon the opposite way would be even more welcome. Aside from when facing the bosses, sticking with the blue X formation shot is probably the most useful for much of the game. The power-ups are good though, giving your base weapon plenty of oomph, while the homing drone really helps you as the game gets harder. And boy is it hard, especially if you lose all your power-ups, as Gradius syndrome kicks in and you find yourself making little to no progress. Lose a life and you'll restart at a checkpoint that can often be quite far back, and with no decent weaponry it can get frustrating. Mitigating this somewhat is an absolute ton of continues, 20 on easy mode, but if you do continue you'll restart right at the beginning of the stage, so making progress to the next level before losing all your lives is vital. Despite all those continues, I've never been able to get past the third stage, as you face an overwhelming number of enemies and complex bosses. Honestly, for me this is not one of the better shooters on the Mega Drive, even at the relatively low price, but it's certainly one of the toughest after the first stage, so it may appeal to the more hardened shoot 'em up fan. Let's move on then to another horizontally scrolling shooter, Biohazard Battle. This was published by Sega in 1992. During the first global biowar on the planet Acheron, a retrovirus unleashed biological forces which couldn't be stopped, leaving the planet filled with new and deadly forms of life. Only a few survivors remain in suspended animation on Odysseus, an orbiting platform circling the planet. The crew of the space station, along with 4 organic ships known as biowarriors, have been frozen for hundreds of years, and now the onboard computer has awakened them. Probes show that conditions on Acheron are hostile but livable, and so the biowarriors are sent to scout areas which have been designated least hostile, hoping to find a new home for the remaining survivors. This game allows 2 simultaneous players with 4 different craft available. Each has different weapons and their flight speeds also vary. Ships are permanently equipped with a power star which can be positioned to block enemy projectiles. There's also an array of different weapons at the ship's disposal, activated by collecting the relevant power-ups. The player travels through 8 stages, with the last 3 only being available on the higher difficulty level. Despite the many obstacles in the landscape, the player cannot be harmed by anything other than an enemy or enemy fire. Players can however die by being crushed between the screen's edge and a wall. This is another Megadrive shooter that stands out from the crowd thanks to its vibrant colours, biological enemies and varied stages with primarily natural environments. Scrolling is fast and the screen is frequently packed with sprites and bullets, with some of the enemies huge and well animated. The end of level bosses are especially large and well designed to fit the theme of the levels they occupy. Your ship only has a simple forward shot which can be charged up by holding the fire button down, but the drone that accompanies you fires different weapons based on the power-ups collected, which can be levelled up quite impressively. Each of the 4 ships on offer has different weapon variations, and there are pros and cons for the different weapon types, with the 8-way firing blue shot and the red homing shot being the best. The drone also acts as a shield, but it can be annoying that you can't lock its position as it rotates around you as you move. Your ship is quite large and can be hard to keep track of, getting lost in all the mayhem which can lead to cheap deaths. The game has options for different difficulty levels and the number of lives, which definitely helps, and you also get plenty of continues. You'll need them as it's a tough game with things getting especially hard from level 4 on. There are some areas where it's almost impossible not to be killed, such as level 2's impassable girders and level 4 with its abundance of enemies in confined spaces. There's often so much action on screen that there is some slowdown when things get hectic, but this can actually help, so it's not a huge deal. While it's not a perfect game, Biohazard Battle's appealing visuals, 2-player co-op mode and range of options make it an excellent choice in this price range, and it's probably my favourite of the 10 games featured in this video. Up next is Xenon 2 Mega Blast, released by Virgin Games in 1992. This vertical scrolling shooter originated on the Amiga and Atari ST in 1989 and was later converted to the Mega Drive and a host of other systems. The game takes place a millennium after the original Xenon, and the aim is to destroy a series of bombs planted throughout history by the Xenites, the vengeful antagonists of the first game. The player controls the Mega Blaster, a small battlecraft equipped with a basic forward-firing weapon, which is shielded from enemy attacks and collisions. The game is split into 5 levels, ranging in theme from the Cambrian era to futuristic metallic spaceways. The levels are inhabited by aggressive life forms that have been mutated by radiation from the bombs. Attacks from these enemies will decrease the player's shield, and if it's totally depleted, the ship will be destroyed. The shield also sustains damage if the ship is trapped in a corner of the scenery and is crushed as the screen continues to scroll. The player can reverse the direction of scrolling to a limited extent by pushing down when the ship's at the bottom of the screen. Large bosses are found at the end of each level, and when they're defeated, the bomb within the level will defuse. Capsules can occasionally be found which release one of a variety of collectible tokens when destroyed. These can augment the ship's weaponry or speed or restore shield. Destroyed enemies leave behind currency, the quantity and value of which depends on the size of the enemy. This can be used to buy and sell weaponry and other add-ons at a shop which the player can access twice per level. The game's subtitle is derived from the song Mega Blast Hip Hop on Precinct 13 by Bomb the Bass, which was famously incorporated as the game's primary musical theme. Xenon 2 was a real classic on the Amiga, but to be honest, it already seemed dated by the time it reached the Mega Drive. The sampled Bomb the Bass music was impressive at the time, but it soon becomes boring and repetitive now as it plays through all the levels. The trademark metallic Bitmap Brothers graphics are mixed with a biological style, at least in the early levels, and they're nicely drawn but lacking in variety and colour. The game is quite slow paced and play can be quite strategic at times, especially with having to move up and down through maze-like sections and pick the right path. The backwards scrolling is quite a weird thing though, and I don't think any other games were ever inspired by that idea. The variety of enemies is good, with moving formations and static ones on the walls that must be picked off before their shots home in on you. There are some huge well-drawn bosses with different attack patterns which are fairly easy to suss out, to be honest. The shop is a fun idea with lots of great weapons to choose from that can also be levelled up, and you don't lose them when you lose a life or even when you restart after game over, so that does allow you to blast your way through to the later levels quite easily. Your health bar can be replenished by the shop or by power-ups, but it does get run down pretty fast when enemies make contact from behind, which happens quite a bit and is a little unfair. One power up that's highly recommended is the sideways firing guns, which are almost essential in some parts of the game, such as the spider boss on level 2. This is another shooter that slows down badly when there's lots of sprites on screen, and it's also hard to make out some enemies against the backgrounds, and really hard to dodge or even see a lot of the bullets, which are generally small and grey. Xenon 2 certainly has some neat ideas that were ahead of their time, but the game itself is quite dull and is nowhere near on the level of the many Japanese shooters that the system was graced with. While it isn't hugely expensive, I think the price of this one is largely driven by nostalgia rather than the quality of the game, and there are better options out there for similar money. Just 2 more games to go then, and the next one is Gainaug, also known as Wings of War. This was published by Sega in 1991 and developed by NCS. The heavens are being attacked by the demons of Iccus, led by a being known only as the Destroyer. The angel Gainaug must bring the fight to Iccus and put an end to the Destroyer's dark plans. The game consists of 6 horizontally scrolling levels, each with a mid and end of level boss. Gainaug's main weapon has 3 different patterns which can be changed by collecting certain power-ups, while the power and size of the normal shot can be upgraded by picking up other items. The player can also collect magic spells, 6 offensive and 2 defensive, and hold up to 3 of them in reserve. Spells drain a magic counter as they use, and they are removed from the spell inventory when spent. Feathers can also be collected to increase your speed of movement. When a life is lost, Gainaug respawns immediately but loses 1 level of his weapon power and size and returns to baseline speed. This fantasy themed shooter has really nice earthy, natural looking graphics and an excellent range of enemies with different formations and patterns. There are often tons of bullets and enemies on screen, but the game never seems to suffer from slowdown. It has a brilliant fantasy themed soundtrack too, but the sound effects are a bit on the basic side. The game has very long levels and there are no checkpoints if you lose all your lives, which you will to begin with because it is very hard. It does include a fair number of continues and options for difficulty level and number of lives, but even the lowest difficulty setting is very challenging. It's pretty generous with the power-ups though, with upgrades to your main weapons to increase its spread, speed boosts and a wide range of magical secondary weapons which have limited quantity or duration. This is another one that suffers from the Gradius effect though, being much easier when fully powered up and borderline impossible if you lose a life at the wrong moment. Progress can be hard until you get to grips with the many enemy types and how best to dispatch them. Aside from the enemies, there's lots of stuff trying to obscure your view, like a shaking screen effect accompanied by falling rocks, bubbles on the underwater stage and backgrounds that you fly behind. You can also die by hitting the borders of the screen, which is especially annoying on the second level, which has the aforementioned bubble effects. The levels are probably a little too long, so it does tend to get a bit tedious, but it's still a decent and challenging game that's worth checking out for the right price. Rounding out this list is Super Fantasy Zone, published by Sega in 1993. This was the final game in the Fantasy Zone series and essentially has the same core gameplay as the arcade original. The game follows Opa Opa as he fights to avenge the death of his father Opapa, who was killed defending the Fantasy Zone against the invading Dark Menon. Opa Opa must rid the Fantasy Zone of the minions of the Dark Menon and restore peace. The player must clear each level by shooting down all of the enemy generators. Once every generator in the level has been destroyed, a Menon Guardian will appear, and defeating this boss will complete the stage. In order to obtain better weapons and extra lives, the player needs to collect gold. Coins will be dropped when an enemy is destroyed, and vast amounts of gold will also be awarded when the Guardians are defeated. Shops will appear at points during each level for a short amount of time. Unlike any other game on this list, Super Fantasy Zone is a cute-em-up with Defender-style multi-directional push scrolling that also scrolls gently by itself. It really is a feast for the eyes, or perhaps assault on the senses, with its nauseatingly colourful graphics, bouncy background tunes and jolly sound effects. It's packed with lots of different cartoony enemies with varying attack patterns, some of which are so delightful it seems a shame to destroy them. On the face of it, gameplay seems pretty simple. Shoot all the enemies on a level, then kill the boss, and collect coins to use in the shop for speed, weapon and bomb enhancements and special attacks. However, this cute and colourful game is deceptively hard, especially on later stages if you have no decent weapons. You need to balance risk and reward, as you can use your cash to tool up early on, or save your money to get bigger power-ups later on if you get that far. The game has good options as you can adjust number of lives, difficulty level and switch on auto fire, but there are no continues and it can be hard to see bullets and sometimes enemies on the garish backgrounds. It won't be for everyone, but this is a unique type of shooter for the system that is fun and addictive if you can get into it. So there you have it, 10 Mega Drive shooters that won't cross the earth, or maybe they will if you can't save it while playing them. I hope you found this guide useful, and if you've played any of these games then please leave a comment and let me know which ones you like the most, and be sure to tell me if there's any low priced Mega Drive shooters that I missed. If you enjoyed this video then please give it a like and consider subscribing to my channel. Thanks very much for watching, and come back soon for more retro gaming content.